The morning she bought the ewes, Vera Stanton paid $22 for the lot of them, and everyone in the county who heard about it said the same thing in slightly different words. She had lost her mind along with her mother. 70 animals, sunken flanks, wool so matted with burr and clay it hung off them like rotten thatch. The man selling them was a decent enough fellow named Corey Aldrich, who had taken over his father-in-law's operation and discovered too late that he understood very little about sheep and even less about the particular patch of limestone shelf they grazed. He had been feeding them on credit for 11 months, and the feed merchant had stopped extending it. He needed them gone before the next bill arrived. $22, he said, meaning it as a mercy, meaning she would be doing him a favor. Vera counted the notes into his hand on a Tuesday morning in early October, loaded the ewes onto a borrowed trailer in 4 separate trips, and drove them 14 miles to the old Stanton place, which her mother had left her along with a clay-caked trunk she had not yet had the heart to open. The trunk sat in the corner of the kitchen with a piece of sailcloth over it. Vera looked at it each morning and each morning looked away. The neighbors watched her unload the animals from the fence line. Not all of them, but enough. She paid no attention to the watching. She brought the ewes into the near pasture, the one her mother had always called the south field below, and she stood among them in the thin October light and ran her hands slowly along their spines, pressing the wool apart to feel the bone beneath. She did this for a long time. Her old dog, a gray-muzzled hound named Cobb, moved through the flock with her, nose low, serious and attentive, as though he too were taking inventory. The bone was close to the surface. That was the first fact. The second fact was that they were still on their feet. Third, the eyes were clear in most of them. Fourth, their hooves, when she lifted them one by one, were long and split and terrible, but the tissue beneath was not rotted through. These facts she did not share with anyone. They belonged to her and to the ewes, and possibly to Cobb, who sat and watched her at each examination with the attentive patience of a student who already suspects the answer. That evening she went to the kitchen and stood before the trunk for a long time. Then she lifted the sailcloth and opened the hasp and raised the lid. Her mother, Ida Stanton, had kept records the way other women kept recipes, compulsively, precisely, in handwriting so small, and even it looked typeset. There were 11 notebooks in the trunk, spanning 41 years, beginning when Ida was 23, and the Stanton land was still running cattle, and ending the autumn before she died, when the sheep operation had been sold off and the pastures stood empty. Each notebook was dated on the spine in red ink. Each entry was tagged with weather, temperature if she had it, and the state of the grass in terms Vera remembered from childhood: short, medium, standing, brown standing, dormant green, frost-tipped, frost-killed. Vera carried the notebooks to the kitchen table, moved the lamp, and began to read. She did not go to bed that night. Stones keep what soil forgets. Her mother had written that line on the inside cover of the 3rd notebook, and again at the start of the 6th, and again in slightly different ink as though she had returned to it years later, on the inside back cover of the last. It was not a phrase her mother had invented. She had attributed it, in a marginal note, to her own grandmother, who had run the south field below as hayground before anyone in the valley thought of putting sheep to limestone shelf. Vera read it 3 times in the 3rd notebook before she understood that it was not a sentiment. It was an instruction. She set the notebook down. She looked out the window at the dark pasture where 70 starving ewes stood in the cold and breathed steam into the October air. She picked the notebook up again. She read until 4 in the morning when the lamp oil guttered, and then she sat in the dark for a little while, and then she went to bed. She was up before sunrise. The work she began that week was the work people would later say proved she had come unhinged. She did not correct them. Correction would have cost her time she did not have. What she did was this: she began moving stone. The south field below had, like most limestone shelf pasture in the region, a surface geography of shallow soil interrupted by ledge outcroppings, and here and there, the remnants of old construction. The collapsed footings of a hay barn, a dry stacked wall running northeast to southwest across the lower quarter of the field, and, in the field's lowest corner nearest the old creek draw, a rubble heap so overgrown with hawthorn and sumac that it had been invisible for so long it no longer registered as anything but landscape. Vera's mother had marked it in the notebooks. She had marked it in the first notebook and the third and the sixth, and in the seventh she had drawn a sketch in pencil, a rough rectangle approximately 16 feet by 20, with a notation that read, "Stone arch intact as of 1931, confirmed by father. Lintels sound. Vent shaft blocked by elder collapse, date unknown. A root cellar, lost not by catastrophe but by neglect and vegetation. 50 years of sumac, give or take." Vera hired no one. She could not afford to. She began cutting hawthorn with a billhook on a Wednesday morning, and she cut hawthorn every morning before the ewes needed tending and every evening after they were settled. And on the seventh day she uncovered the first worked stone of the outer wall, and she put her hand flat against it the way you put your hand against a warm stove, feeling for what is still alive in there. The stone gave nothing back. It was cold. It was limestone, and it was old, and it was cold. But it was plumb. She marked the stone with a chip of chalk and kept cutting. Cobb watched from a distance of approximately 4 feet, moving when she moved, stopping when she stopped. The ewes, beginning now to show the first faint signs that the Stanton grass was agreeing with them, occasionally drifted near the hawthorn thicket and observed the operation with the sideways attentiveness of animals who are not curious, but are not entirely indifferent either. It was during the third week of cutting that Dale Pruitt came by. Dale Pruitt was the county extension agent, a large, careful man who had held the post for 16 years and who believed, not unkindly, that he had seen every variety of bad decision a farmer could make. He drove a green truck, and he parked it at the gate, and he walked across the near pasture with the measured stride of a man who is performing a welfare check on someone who does not know it is a welfare check. He looked at the ewes. He looked at the hawthorn rubble. He looked at Vera, who was on her knees with a pry bar working a matted root mass out from between 2 courses of old stone. He said it looked like hard going. She said it was. He said he had heard she bought these animals from Corey Aldrich. She said that was right. He said, gently, that Aldrich's sheep had been known to have a liver fluke situation and that he hoped she had had them tested. She said she had treated them the week she brought them home. He waited for her to continue, and she did not continue, because there was nothing more to say on that subject. He said what he had actually come to say, which was that the county land bank had an interest in distressed agricultural properties, and that if she found herself in a position where the land was more burden than benefit, there were options. He said this carefully, the way a man says a thing he has been asked to say by someone who did not have the courage to say it themselves. She understood that there were people in town who had sent him. She thanked him. She put the pry bar under the root mass again, and he understood the meeting was over. He walked back to the green truck. He drove away. She heard the tires on the gravel long after she stopped being able to see the truck. Then she could not hear them either, and there was only the sound of the bar against the stone and the sound of the ewes cropping grass and the sound of Cobb settling himself onto a flat outcrop nearby with a quiet grunt of elder animal complaint. She did not think about what Dale Pruitt had come to say. She thought about the sketch in the 7th notebook. She thought about the line her great-grandmother had left, the one her grandmother had passed to her mother, and her mother had passed to her through the medium of 11 red-spine notebooks in a clay-caked trunk. Stones keep what soil forgets. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn a stone with your boot to see what is living under it. What her mother had worked out, across 41 years of notation, was this. The limestone shelf held temperature the way a clay pot holds water. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The native grasses rooted into the shelf's fracture lines found moisture there in drought, and found a moderating warmth in early cold. And the sheep that grazed limestone shelf in fall came into winter with a body condition the research journals, if anyone had thought to write it up, would have called remarkable. Her mother had written it up. 11 notebooks worth. She had written that the key was the transition months, that what the animals needed in October and November was not supplemental grain, but time on the south-facing limestone ledge between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, when the stone was shedding its stored heat into the thin autumn air. She had also written that the root cellar mattered because the root cellar was not, in the original construction, merely for roots. It was a shelter. It was low-built and earth-banked on 3 sides, with the 4th side opening to the south under the limestone ledge, and the stone arch at its entrance, if intact, would hold a temperature 10 to 15 degrees above ambient on a still night and 20 degrees above it in a wind. She had written, "I have not used it since Father died, and the hawthorn has taken it, but the arch holds. I know the arch holds because the arch is limestone, and limestone does not forget." The Ewes would need a place to lamb in February. Vera had done the arithmetic. She could not afford to heat a barn. She could not afford a barn. What she had was 70 ewes who were slowly, daily, demonstrably beginning to fill out on Stanton limestone grass, and a root cellar buried under 50 years of sumac that her mother had known about, and her grandmother had known about, and her great-grandmother had built and named and possibly loved. She kept cutting. November came in sideways. The temperature dropped 14 degrees in a single afternoon in the first week, and a man named Tolliver, who ran the large merino operation on the valley floor and who had been in conversation with the county land bank for reasons of his own, drove past the Stanton place on his way home and saw through the bare trees the figure of Vera Stanton on her knees at the edge of a hawthorn thicket, working a pry bar by lantern light. He stopped his truck. He rolled down the window. He asked if she wanted help. She said no. He said it was getting dark. She said she knew it. He sat for a moment in the warmth of his truck cab looking at her in the cold and the dark, and then he rolled the window up and drove on. He mentioned it at the feed store the following morning. The feed store was a reliable distribution point for local observation, and by noon most of the valley knew that Vera Stanton was digging something out of the hawthorn with a pry bar by lantern light in the first serious cold of November, and the consensus, delivered in varying tones of concern and derision, was that grief had settled into her in a particular way, and that perhaps someone ought to do something. What they did, collectively, was nothing. What Vera did was uncover the stone arch on a Saturday in the second week of November. She uncovered it in the morning, with Cobb beside her, and she stood and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The arch was 4 feet tall at the crown and perhaps 5 feet wide, built of dressed limestone blocks in the manner of the mid-19th century, with a flat capstone above it that had been, at some point, inscribed. The inscription was weathered past reading, but the shape of the letters was still there under her fingers when she traced them. She did not try to read them. She stood and looked at the arch, and then she got down on her hands and knees and crawled through it. Inside, the temperature was different. Not dramatically, but differently. The air was still, and the stone, which she had expected to be cold, was less cold than the air outside, as though it had been thinking warmly all through the 50 years of neglect and had simply been waiting for someone to notice. The vault was intact, 16 feet by 20, as the sketch had indicated. The floor was earthen, dry, and packed to a near hardness. The vent shaft in the far wall was blocked with bird nesting material and collapsed elder, and this she marked for clearing. The lintels above the vent were sound. She took a candle from her coat pocket and lit it, and held it up and walked the perimeter of the space with her hand trailing along the wall, and the wall was, throughout, plumb and true and cold and patient and entirely indifferent to the 50 years during which no one had asked anything of it. She said one word, alone in the old cellar, to no one. She said, "Good." Then she crawled back out and went to feed the ewes. The person who came to help arrived without announcement on a Monday morning 3 days after the arch was uncovered. Her name was Ruth Calder, and she was 60 years old and had spent 30 of those years working sheep on the other side of the county until her own land was sold for a subdivision and she had taken work, temporarily, at the grain merchants in town, where she had heard certain things about a woman and 70 ewes and a hawthorn thicket, and had driven out to see. She sat in her truck for a moment at the gate, watching Vera move through the flock in the morning light, and then she got out and walked across the field and said nothing until she was within speaking distance, at which point she said, "They've come on." Vera looked up. She said, 6 weeks. Ruth looked at the Ewes for a while. She had the look of someone reading a language she knew well, checking the statements in it for accuracy. Then she said, root cellar? Vera said, arch is clear. Ruth said, vent shaft? Vera said, blocked, 5 feet. Ruth said, I've got a long-handled auger. Vera said, bring it Tuesday. Ruth brought it Tuesday. She also brought, without being asked, a quantity of clean straw and a box of the particular mineral supplement Vera would not have known to look for, which Ruth had come across in an article in a sheep journal 7 years ago and had never forgotten because it was the kind of thing, once you understood it, you could not believe had not been obvious all along. She set the supplement on the kitchen table, and Vera read the article, which Ruth had kept folded in her coat pocket, and then looked at the mineral composition, and then looked at the notebooks, which were still spread across the kitchen table where they had been since October. She said, my mother circled around this. Ruth looked at the notebooks. She said, your mother knew the grass was doing it. Vera said, she didn't have the piece about the minerals. Ruth said, now you do. They did not say a great deal more than that. They went out and began clearing the vent shaft. December. The work shifted from uncovering to preparing. They cleaned the vault floor and laid new earth over the packed center to improve drainage. They cleared the vent shaft to a depth of 4 feet and rebuilt the collar of it with stacked limestone. They brought in timber from the collapsed hay barn footings to make simple raised pallets along the walls, and they banked the east and north exterior walls of the cellar with excavated subsoil, 3 feet deep, tamped hard. They fitted the arch opening with a timber-framed door of rough boards, hung on iron pintles Vera found in the tool shed still wrapped in oilcloth, as though her mother had known someone would need them. The ewes, by December, were different animals from the ones Vera had loaded off Corey Aldrich's ruined pasture. They were not fat, they were not spectacular. But the wool hung right, and the eyes were bright, and the bone beneath the flesh was padded now with something that belonged there. Ruth took the body condition score on 10 of them at random in the second week of December and wrote the numbers in a notebook and showed them to Vera, who looked at them and then looked at the 7th of her mother's notebooks, which was open to the page with the pencil sketch of the root cellar. Vera said, she said 4.1 average by solstice. Ruth looked at her own numbers. She said 4.2. Then they went back to work. The confidence of the valley ran on a different calendar. In December, Tolliver expanded his merino operation by 47 head, purchasing a large lot of registered ewes at a price Vera would not have been able to approach with all the money she owned. He built a new enclosed barn with a forced air heating system and automatic waterers, and the county paper ran a short item about it, with a photograph of Tolliver standing in front of the new barn in a clean coat and the headline reading, Modern Methods and a Bright Future. The new ewes were in prime condition when they arrived. The barn was warm and well lit. None of this was wrong. It was just not what the notebooks predicted. What the notebooks predicted was a dry winter, followed by an early warm spell, followed by a hard freeze in the second week of February. Based on the accumulated pattern of 41 years of observation on this specific piece of limestone shelf in this specific valley, cross-referenced against 3 other significant event years Ida Stanton had lived through and documented in granular detail. A freeze that came after warmth was different from a freeze that came in steady cold. It found the animals extended, their metabolisms already beginning to shift toward spring. It found the water systems unprepared. It found the electric systems drawn past their engineering limits by desperate supplemental heating. It found the new growth grass, already pushed up by the warm spell, lying flat and black under a sudden inch of ice. Ida Stanton had seen it 3 times. She had written, "The valley forgets this pattern because it is not annual. It comes in a long cycle, 15 to 20 years, and each time it comes, the people who have moved in since the last time are certain it is unprecedented. It is not unprecedented. I have the record. Vera had the record. She completed the final preparations for the cellar on the 1st of February. She banked additional soil against the north wall. She laid the last of the straw on the pallets. She checked the vent collar and found it sound. She filled the low stone water trough inside the arch with clean water and covered it with a board to slow freezing. The vault temperature on the 1st of February, measured by the dairy thermometer she hung from the center timber, read 41 degrees. Outside, in the afternoon sun, it was 38. Ruth came on the 1st of February, and they walked the ewes slowly into the cellar in groups of 7, which was how many the space comfortably held on rotation, and they were quiet doing it, and the ewes were, to Vera's surprised relief, not troubled by the low space or the dark. They went in, and they stood on the straw pallets, and they breathed the still air of a vault that had not held breath in 50 years, and steam rose slowly from their wool into the cold stone above them, and the stone accepted it without complaint. The warm spell came on the 5th of February. 4 days of air soft enough that Vera opened her coat walking to the field in the morning. The grass, where the limestone ledge had warmed it, showed green at the blade tips. The sky was a pale, flat, deceiving blue. Tolliver, 3 miles away on the valley floor, opened the barn's south ventilation panels to take advantage of the mild air. The ewes in his new barn were 9 weeks from their due dates, in excellent registered condition, and the automatic waterers ran cleanly, and the heating system sat idle in the pleasant warmth. On the 9th of February, Vera and Ruth stood at the edge of the south field below in the last of the mild afternoon and looked at the sky to the northwest. Ruth said, "Tonight." Vera said, "Or early." They went and settled the ewes. The freeze arrived at 3 in the morning on the 10th of February. It arrived at 3 degrees Fahrenheit. It arrived behind a wind that came northwest and drove the temperature down another 4 degrees in the first hour and coated everything standing in a layer of clear ice that caught the moonlight and turned the valley floor into something that looked almost beautiful from a distance and was, from close up, catastrophic. Tolliver's water lines froze solid by 4 in the morning. The automatic waterers became blocks. The south ventilation panels, which he had not remembered to close, admitted a column of wind that dropped the barn temperature 17 degrees in 40 minutes and tripped the heating system's high-demand circuit, which went out. The registered merino ewes, in mid-pregnancy, in a barn suddenly running at 21 degrees with wind driving through the open panels, began to show distress before dawn. He was there by 5 in the morning. He worked alone for 2 hours, which was how long it took to get the panels closed and the heating system reset, and by 7 he had the barn back to a manageable temperature and the waterers chiseled free enough to drip. 3 of the ewes had aborted. He did not yet know that. He would not know it until later in the morning, when the light was better. He drove past the Stanton place on his way to get the veterinarian. He stopped the truck. He looked through the bare trees. There was smoke rising from the Stanton kitchen chimney and from the small iron stovepipe that Vera had fitted through the cellar's vent collar as a secondary warming measure for the coldest hours. The stone vault would not drop below 38 degrees even without it, but Ruth had insisted, and the insistence had been correct. Vera was visible in the near pasture, moving through the ewes that were rotating out of the cellar into the morning light, checking each one with her hands as she passed, unhurried. Cobb moved beside her. Tolliver sat in the truck for a long time. The engine ran. He watched the smoke rise from the Stanton vent pipe and the steam rise off the ewes in the thin winter light, and Vera Stanton moving through them like a woman who has known the outcome for months and is only now watching it arrive. He drove on. He came back in the afternoon, after the veterinarian, after the emergency work, after the counting. He parked the truck at the Stanton gate, and he sat there for a while before he got out. He was a large man, and he moved that afternoon as though he had become heavier since morning. He walked across the near pasture, and he found Vera at the cellar entrance, checking the thermometer. He said he'd had a hard morning. She said she'd heard. He stood looking at the cellar door, the rough timber frame, the old limestone arch behind it. He said he hadn't known this was here. She said, "My great-grandmother built it." He said, "Does it work?" She said, 41 degrees last night." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, very carefully, in the manner of a man spending something he cannot get back, I should have asked what you were doing out here, months ago, instead of watching from the road." She looked at him. She did not say, "Yes, you should have." She said, "Do you want to come in and get warm?" He came in. She put water on. Ruth came in from the field, and the three of them sat in the kitchen with the notebooks spread on the table, and Vera showed him the pattern his barn had been built to perform through, and he sat and looked at the numbers without speaking for a long time. He said, "How long has this been known?" Vera said, "Depends who you ask." He said, "How long has your family known it?" She pulled the third notebook toward him and opened it to the inside cover. He read the line. He read it twice. He looked up. She said, "My great-grandmother." 41 years of record after that. He sat with that. By March, 6 of Tolliver's shepherdless neighbors had come to Vera with questions. 2 of them had suffered losses in the February event. One had lost an entire lambing shed's worth of infrastructure to frozen pipe failure. They came the way people come when something that was supposed to be impossible has happened, and they need someone to help them rebuild their understanding of what is possible. Vera let them read the notebooks. She showed them the limestone management system her mother had spent 41 years refining. She walked them through the cellar, which by then held the first of the Stanton lambs, 43 born in 12 days, clean and vigorous, in a vault that smelled of straw and stone and the particular dense animal warmth of a sheltered birth. She charged no one for the reading. The notebooks were not hers to sell. They belonged, as she understood it, to the valley, which had produced both the problem and its solution across the span of several lifetimes, and which would need them again in another 15 to 20 years when the pattern returned, and the people who had not been there for this one were certain it was unprecedented. Ruth stayed on at the Stanton place. She did not make a formal announcement about this. She simply stayed, and her truck was parked at the gate, and the 2 of them worked, and the lambs came. Cobb, who was old, was given the task of sleeping near the cellar door, which he accepted with the gravity of an animal who understands a final assignment. Spring arrived without ceremony. The ice went, the grass came. The ewes went back out onto the south field below Limestone Ledge and grazed between 10 and 2 in the manner the notebooks prescribed, and the limestone accepted their weight with the impersonal hospitality of stone that is older than all of this and will outlast all of this, and simply continues to hold what it has been holding, because no one has come along yet with reason enough to stop it. By summer, people were calling it the Stanton method, though it was older than Ida Stanton and older than her mother and possibly as old as the arch itself, which bore the date 1857 and the worn initial letters of a name no one had been able to read in 50 years. Vera cleaned the inscription with a brush and vinegar in late July. She did it carefully, working around the stone surface in the low morning light when shadows made carved letters easiest to read. The letters came clear slowly, the way things come clear when you are patient enough to wait for the right light. The name was M. Calder. She stood back and looked at it. Then she went inside and found Ruth in the kitchen and said nothing, only tilted her head toward the door. Ruth went out and stood before the arch for a long time. She did not say anything when she came back in. She sat down at the kitchen table with one of the notebooks open in front of her, and she was quiet for a while. And then she said, "My grandmother came from this valley. Before my family moved across the county, I thought it was just a thing she said." Vera said, "What did she say?" Ruth said, "She said stones keep what soil forgets." They sat with that in the kitchen, with the summer light coming through the south window and the sound of the ewes in the field and the old dog at the door. In time, the root cellar was extended, shored, and documented. A member of the County Historical Society came and photographed the arch and the inscription, and recorded what Vera told him. The notebooks were eventually transcribed and deposited with the Agricultural College, where a graduate student wrote a thesis about passive thermal management in limestone shelf grazing systems and cited them extensively, referring to the author in the thesis as Ida Stanton, farmer and naturalist, who between 1909 and 1950 compiled the most continuous microclimate record in the region, and who is credited with the preservation of a lambing vault of demonstrable historical and practical significance. The graduate student also quoted, in the thesis's opening pages, the line from the third notebook, attributing it correctly to an unnamed ancestor of Ida Stanton's, a woman whose first initial was M and whose last name was Calder, and who built the arch in 1857, and apparently said the same true thing often enough that it survived her by a century and still worked. The line read, "Stones keep what soil forgets." The cellar is still in use. It has not been left to fill with hawthorn again. The south-facing arch stands as it stood when it was built, plumb and patient under the limestone shelf, holding whatever it is holding, waiting for whoever is next willing to learn what it knows.